Hello there. This is Polytalks, and this will be the 2022 midterms House and Governor's forecast. So let's dive right on in. We will begin with a look at the House forecast. Now, based on these forecasts, it's quite apparent that the Republicans will fairly easily win control of the United States House of Representatives. It is certainly not impossible for the Democrats to retain control, but would require complete and utter bucking of our expectations and a very shocking result come election day. Not impossible, but highly unlikely. And that is reflected by a variety of forecasts. First, we have 538, which has historically been in favor of Democrats when it comes to polling errors and forecasts. And then we have real clear politics, which has been slightly more accurate in terms of the presidential election, but it's certainly not a God-given forecast. That has a much more dire situation for Democrats, having them at a maximum or potentially minimum of 174 seats, which would be a terrible result for Democrats, and that would be a near 2010 level of electoral defeat for Democrats. Although I would like to take this forecast with a grain of salt. I do think some of real clear politics predictions this cycle have been reasonable, and others have been questionable, to say the least. Although I do think real clear politics could end up becoming one of the most accurate forecasts come the midterm elections. Now, it's also important to look at other sources too, such as 270, and this has another dire situation for Democrats, although not quite as dire, because we can see here Democrats have a minimum of 200 seats, which is quite a decent result for Democrats considering the national environment. That is only a net loss of, I believe, 22 seats, so that would still be a poor result for Democrats, but it would be nowhere near an electoral blowout. And I think this is probably my trusted forecast for the elections. And just to give you some context on what 538 expects in terms of seat gains for each party, I believe it is down here. Yes, so right now we can see they expect the Democrats to win 206 seats on average. Obviously, take this with a grain of salt, which is slightly more than this forecast. So I'd say striking a balance between 538 and real clear politics, I'd say this is probably my most trusted forecast, especially because you have expert ratings and it goes down into depth here. So we have various interesting races here, and while many of them favor Republicans, if you were to tell me 2 years ago that Alaska would be competitive this cycle, I would have laughed in your face. But right now, it is actually looking like the Democrat is expected to win in the state of Alaska, and that will be more of an exception. That will be more so due to the independent nature of Alaska, combined with the unpopularity of Sarah Palin and the infighting between the Republican candidates. Although it is still important to note, Democrats do not have all bad news this cycle. Although, if you look here in many of these races, even those with Democratic incumbents, you can see that a more dicey picture begins to emerge for Democrats. You have toss-up races in what were previously expected to be easy Democratic wins. You have Democratic seats expected to go into Republican hands. And due to the redistricting cycle, this is no ordinary election. We have, incumbents running against each other in the primaries, and these districts are not the same as they were in 2020, but still, this is not a great outlook for Democrats, although it certainly could be worse according to that forecast. This forecast in 538. Real clear politics certainly, I think, pictures the worst case scenario for Democrats. I believe 174 seats is probably the worst performance this election cycle. If it is any less than that for Democrats, I will begin to question strongly the accuracy of these polling sites, which have already had missteps in the past. But I think the main takeaway from this is I believe Republicans will certainly win the House, and I expect them to do it by around 20 to 30 seats. Although I think there was a period of time in which Democrats were actually closing down the gap right here. So it is important to note there have been times in the cycle where Democrats have had a real chance of clinching the majority, and I certainly would not be shocked out of my mind if that happened on election day, although it would still be a surprise for sure. And so I just really wanted to touch on the reality for Democrats here and the fact that with the combination of redistricting and inflation and economic concerns, we are really beginning to see a clearer outlook of what doesn't look like a Republican tsunami, but is certainly a decent majority for them. And it will make governing very difficult for President Biden and congressional Democrats. And now I want to shift over to the governor's race. And we can see 538's governor forecast. We have a couple of interesting races here. We actually have quite a few competitive governor's elections, which is always interesting to analyze. So I'll start with the competitive Democratic held seats. So indeed, we have Kansas here, which is quite a surprise, honestly, when you're considering many of these likely races here. Maine, Michigan, Minnesota, New Mexico, these races have all been historically competitive, and so it's shocking to see a thought to be deep Republican state like this having a decent strong chance to go to Democrats. Although this is not entirely surprising, Kansas has certainly bucked expectations in the past with the abortion referendum, and while I by no means think that is an indicator of national trends, it's simply a sign that Kansas is not all hardline conservatives. And then we also can see that Laura Kelly won in 2018, largely due to Chris Kobach's scandals, although it is important to note she has developed somewhat of a popular reputation within the state. And so I do expect her to win, although I think 66% chance is a little too optimistic for Laura Kelly in the state. I think it will be a very close race. I think she will ultimately come on top, but by a very small margin. Just due to the reaching across the aisle of Kansas voters. And then we have Wisconsin, which is an extremely competitive race, even on this forecast. And I do expect this one to go to Republicans. I think with the polls showing Ron Johnson ahead, I don't think there will be too much split ticketing in this election, so I do narrowly expect Tom Avers to lose. Although it's certainly not impossible he pulls ahead. I definitely think this is more competitive than the Senate race in this state. And certainly that will be one of the most contested states on election night. And then moving on, we have Nevada. Again, a very competitive Senate race that seems at this point to be favoring Republicans, and it seems like that has been reflected in this governor's forecast. We can see Steve Sisolak is down to Joe Lombardo. Honestly, this state, I really expected at the beginning of the cycle to go by a decent margin to Democrats, but I was quite shocked. I mean, you think about most of Democrats' voters come from the Clark County, Los Angeles area, and that area strongly founded on gambling, and that industry has been really wrecked to a degree by the economic concerns and COVID-19, and it's really recoiling. And also we've begun to see, Latino support shifting towards Republicans, and the combination of those factors, I think, is really problematic for Democrats here. And I do expect both the Senate and governor's race to go to Republicans. Certainly not by a large majority, but I do expect they will pull through in the end. So that is another highly competitive governor's race. And then we have the Oregon governor's race, which should never have been competitive for Democrats, but it is indeed competitive. And I see this race, I think, has shifted recently. I think it used to be, a Republican favor. So this one's really going back and forth. And ultimately, it's pretty clear here that the competitive nature is coming from the unpopularity of the Democratic incumbent here. And while she is not running, she has been so unpopular in the state, and the state has been so racked by the economy and economic concerns that I think, and especially the vote splitting from the independent here, who seems to have a stronger than expected performance, it's really creating a unfortunate environment for Democrats. And this one is really difficult for me to characterize. While many are expecting this to go to Republicans, I do think the Democrats will narrowly pull ahead. My reasoning being, I do think there is a Senate race in the state in which the Democrat is heavily expected to win, and I just think that the nature of that Senate race and just the fact that we've been seeing more shift towards less split ticket voting, I do believe the state will ultimately end up going to Democrats, though certainly by a narrower margin. And also, I think the independent Betsy Johnson could actually have somewhat of a spoiler effect on the Republican as well as the Democrat. I don't think we can say that she's pulling votes solely from one or the other. I think it's kind of a mixed split, but I do narrowly expect Democrats to win this one, but it's by no means a for sure race for Democrats in the slightest. And then we've already talked about Wisconsin, and then we have Arizona, which is quite an interesting race because Mark Kelly has been leading by quite a large margin for most of this cycle, and in the past few days, his lead has narrowed down quite significantly. Although most forecasts still have him winning, and I agree with that characterization. Although the governor's race has been really quite a shock to me because the Republicanism in the state is very similar to the Republican candidate for the Senate in that they are both election questioners, hardline Trump supporters, and I'd expect that to really polarize and separate the Democrats from the Republicans. And I thought that would ultimately favor the Democrats, but it appears like in this race we are seeing that the Republican is actually pulling ahead, which is quite shocking, honestly. And I do agree with this characterization. I do think she will narrowly pull ahead, and I think Arizona's Senate race will be so close, anyways, that the narrow but prevalent split ticketing effect will end up having a effect on this race and may lead to a split outcome between governor and Senate. And that's the gist of most of the competitive races. Then we have races like Alaska, which is really a strange state, especially since they elected a Democrat, and they're basically the House, the Senate, and the governor are all up this cycle, and we're seeing very different expectations for each of them. We're seeing in the Senate for Alaska, and I think this is actually quite interesting to analyze, if I can find the Senate forecast, we see that it's actually kind of a split expectation for Alaska. So it's basically neck and neck. I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. The Democrat has essentially no chance of winning here, and there's a 50-50 chance between Kelly Tshibaka and Lisa Murkowski. So we're definitely going to have a Republican continue to serve the state of Alaska on the Senate level, although which Republican remains a very serious question. Although I do believe Lisa Murkowski will pull ahead just simply due to her ability to pull votes from both sides. And on the governor's race, it's a little less, and on the governor's race is a little less cut and dry. The House race looks like it's going to Democrats, as I mentioned earlier. The Senate is neck and neck, and the governor's race is a little more cut and dry, although there is some opposition by the Democrat, who is very unlikely to win here, and actually a former governor of Alaska, Bill Walker, who is also unlikely to win. Although, I think an interesting thing looking at these numbers here is you see that the combined total of the Democrat and the Independent is actually over 50% and much stronger than the combined votes of the Republicans. And I definitely don't think all of the independent votes will end up going to a Democrat if that block is eliminated, although I think it will be interesting if the Democrat block is eliminated first. Then I think most of the Democrat votes will end up going to the Independent, and I think we could actually maybe see a more competitive governor's race here than this is alluding to, although I still expect Mike Dunleavy to win at least somewhat comfortably. And then we have other races here, such as Georgia, which was seen as possibly competitive by many early in the cycle. I mean, the Senate race is competitive, and Stacey Abrams, who came very close to defeating Brian Kemp, is running in this cycle. However, things have just not shaken up for Democrats. I think from a political standpoint, Stacey Abrams' decision to run was quite a poor one in such an environment. While Raphael Warnock, the Democratic senator, is pulling a narrow lead above Herschel Walker. This race is really not that competitive, mainly just due to Brian Kemp is a much better candidate for the Republicans than Herschel Walker. He's the incumbent. He's at least fairly popular within Georgia. He's not viewed as too Trumpian because of his efforts to uphold the democratic process here. So that one is not very competitive. And the last of the likelies is in Oklahoma, which should also, similarly to Oregon, never have been competitive, although it is actually, as the Democrat is posing a decent challenge to the Republican incumbent Kevin Stitt, although this one is still widely expected to go through Republicans. And then my last few minutes, I just want to talk about some races that were viewed as competitive but aren't actually competitive. Texas. It's almost 100% Greg Abbott wins. This is another scenario. I think Beto O'Rourke, by deciding to run this race, has essentially tanked his political career. He ran in 2018, and when he came very close to winning that governor's race, people were excited. The Democrats believed they had a chance, and they saw Beto O'Rourke as this rising star, this prominent politician, and then he ran for president in 2020, which is also a very poor decision politically. I think he didn't come anywhere close to getting the nomination, and his decision to run for a third cycle in a row here, I think, is just a very poor one. He will quite clearly lose this race, and while he's not ran a bad campaign, this was just not a great year to run. So I think it's important to look at that. And then Florida. Don't even try and tell me that Florida is competitive this cycle. Charlie Crist also, I believe, should have simply remained as representative here and waited for a better opening to make a Senate or governor's race competitive. But Ron DeSantis, one of the most popular and iconic Republican governors across the nation, he really had no chance, and I don't think there's any realistically opening for a Democrat in this race. And then two other races on the Democratic side, Michigan and Pennsylvania, while not entirely safe bets at this point, also have been made much less competitive, almost purely due to the poor Republican candidates fielded. Tudor Dixon, anti-abortion, in a state that heavily supports abortion. Doug Mastriano, Trump-endorsed, very poor candidate. These two seats simply were missed opportunities for the GOP, considering the competitive Senate races, and are entirely a reflection of the poor candidates fielded in both of these races. So that pretty much concludes this video. Thank you guys for watching, and I will be looking forward to posting an analysis following the midterm elections.